Hi everyone, today I'm going to walk you through the basics of wireframing in Figma. So first question is, what is a wireframe? A wireframe is a low fidelity or a low detail sketch, or you can think of it like an outline of a digital product. So something like an app or a website. It's going to be a rough sketch of what the final website might look like. We create wireframes in the web design process with this minimal amount of detail so that we can really focus on the structure and the flow of the content within the website or app design. And by doing that, we really get to focus on how our users interact with the product, and we don't get distracted by the deep details of how we're going to start to apply aesthetic decisions like color, photography, logos, and fonts. We're stripping all of that away and we're left with the bare basics so that we can make the best design decisions possible. Additionally, this level of simplicity, it allows us to make things really quickly. Wireframing can be a really fast process so that we can quickly try and iterate on different design solutions to a given problem. Typically, like you'll see here in this example wireframe, these are designed in grayscale colors, often with default fonts, and using these placeholder rectangles in place of photography or iconography. So we're really just showing the content and the basic sort of layout or user interface pattern of the site that we're designing. So today, to intro us to wireframing, I'm going to show you how to build a wireframe through what we'll call reverse wireframing. So we'll start with a fully completed site design, and from there, we'll then build a wireframe for the site that already exists. So step one is to pick a website to wireframe. I've got my website open here, and I'm going to wireframe a website called Wooden Spoon Herbs. This is like an organic mushroom and herb supplement website that I thought had a fun design and that I thought would be a good challenge to reverse wireframe. So what you're going to need to do first is go through your website that you've chosen and screenshot each piece of the website. So I'll start with the header and screenshot this whole section. Scroll down to the next section of the website, and so on and so forth. We're going to want to screenshot each of these pieces to then put together again in Figma. So once I have all of my screenshots taken for my website, I can close out. I can load them all into Figma individually. And what I'll want to do is piece them all together one by one to paint the full picture of the website. So you can see here, I've already dropped in all of my screenshots into a long frame that's appropriately sized for desktop at 1440 pixels wide. And I've placed each screenshot in here and stitched them together sequentially to build out the entire website. So now we've put our website together, it's time to start wireframing. The first thing that I like to do is make my wireframe frame. So I can click on my frame tool here, and in this desktop preset menu, I can click on wireframe, which is going to make me a frame in Figma that I can get started on. And my wireframe should end up being the same size as my website homepage that I've stitched together with my screenshots. So I can press Command and click and drag my frame size, and it should snap to the bottom of my frame size of my screenshot website. So I've got my frame set up and ready to go to start wireframing. So once I have my frame set up for my wireframing, I like to establish a grid for my website that I can then So once I have my frame that I'm going to use for my wireframing, what I like to do is establish a grid based on the original website design that I can then use to guide my reverse wireframing process. So if I click on this frame that holds my desktop screenshot, and in my properties window, I can go to this properties box for layout grid, and I'll create a new grid. By default, it's going to make this gridded pixel grid. If I zoom in, you can see it makes this sort of graph paper-like grid, but I want to make a column grid. So in my properties window, I can click on this little grid icon, and using this dropdown, change it to column grid, which is the kind that I want. And I can look at my site that I've chosen and start to play with the amount of columns in my grid until I find something that roughly matches the design of the website I've chosen. So looks like I've got a 3-column grid here, but then a 4-column grid down here, which leads me to believe that this is probably built on a 12-column grid because it's divisible by both 3 and 4. So I'll put in 12 columns. And then I can use this edge on the site here to figure out the width of my margins. Looks like it's probably about 30 pixels. And then I can use my gutter tool, zoom in a little bit, and really figure out what the gutter of my site is. But it looks like I have it about right at 20 pixels. So if I feel confident that this grid is more or less going to work for the design that I've chosen to reverse wireframe, what I can do is click on this 4-dot button right here, which you can see is the style button, and then click this plus to add a new style. I've already made one called Wooden Spoon, which is the same grid that I've made here. But if I click plus again, just to show you what this does, this will create a grid style that I'll just call new style for demo. And I can click create. And it'll save this grid that I've created here that I can then apply to any frame. So if I have my wireframe selected and I go to my layout grid panel here, I can click on this same style button and click new style for demo, and it'll automatically apply my grid style that I've created to my new frame. For now, though, I'm going to use the preset grid that I've created, which should just be the same. Looks about the same. Okay, so we've set up our frame and we've set up our grid, and now we're really ready to start reverse wireframing. So you could just start from the top section of the website, but what I like to do personally is to pick a section of the website that has a little more content, that's going to like use my grid in maybe a more granular way than just having a big photo with some big text. Something that's really going to show my type hierarchy and start creating elements that I'm going to use on the site over and over again, like buttons. So I'm going to pick this herbs for all your seasons section. So what I can do is click on it, and I'm just going to press Alt and Shift to duplicate it and perfectly drag it across to my new frame. And now I can see in my layer panel that this is in fact in my frame. So from here, what I'm going to do is basically trace over this existing section of the website from the design that I picked and turn it into a wireframe. So a really helpful way to do this is to select this image for this section of the website, and in my layer panel, I can click on this lock to lock it. And then I'll bring my opacity down just so that it's not as distracting and in my face, but I can still see the details of what's here. So now I'm going to use the design tools that I've already learned in Figma to start my reverse wireframing. So I can take this section and break it out piece by piece, element by element, to then create my wireframe. So the first thing that I notice is that this has a defined green background just for this section. So what I can do is I could use my rectangle tool, or in this case, I might use my frame tool because it sort of creates this entire section of the website. And I can click and drag to make this the right size that I need for this section. Looks like it's about 780 pixels tall by 1440 pixels wide. And now I've started a frame that I can build upon. So I know that I wanted to have this have a fill in it, but that's actually what I'm going to do at the very end, is I'll add a color fill to this section to distinguish it from the rest of the site. Now that I've got that area defined, I can go piece by piece with this layout and just basically recreate it on top, but a really simplified version. So starting with type and this headline, I can take my type tool and I'll just click and I'll type in herbs for all. Looks like my type's already a pretty good size. Don't worry about font or styling at all here. We're just trying to block in where the content will go. And I'm going to follow my grid lines as best I can. And it looks like there's also a little image of a flower here. So what I can do is take my rectangle tool and create just a gray rectangle that I'm actually going to give a stroke instead of a fill. And then I can use my pen tool to make an X shape inside of the square. Okay. And now what I can do is group this, my rectangle and my X vector that I created. And in my layer panel, I'm going to call this placeholder image. Now I can really just duplicate this as many times as I want. And because it's a group, I can easily drag and resize it to be the proportions that I need for any of my placeholder images. So let's bring this down inside this frame and make it roughly the size of our little flower friend here. Okay, great, perfect. So I've got this headline area taken care of. Next, I can do this little menu over here. So let's just duplicate my font here. Something that you should consider doing just for organizational purposes as you make a wireframe is to start grouping content that goes together. So my headline is broken up into two text boxes here with the image in between, but I'm going to group it and just name it headline in my layer panel. That way, if I'm iterating on this design later, or I need to go back and find something and change it, it's pretty easy to just grab any object that you need in Figma, but having your layers labeled in your layer panel just makes it that much easier to navigate. So the next step that I'm going to take is creating this menu. So I'll take my text tool again, click, and type in stress. Looks like that type is a little too big, so I'm going to tweak my settings over here. Looks like this is probably 18-point type. And then I'll fix my line spacing and my letter spacing to match a little better. Looks like it might even be smaller than that, so I'll bring this down to 16 points. And then I can align this with my guidelines nice and neatly. Make sure everything's nice and aligned with my guides. Okay. So now I can duplicate this 5 times. So one thing that's important to note about web design is, unlike InDesign, where you're laying out a book and you want everything to remain in one text box, in web design, everything is contained in individual boxes. So each line of type should really be its own text box. That's going to make it easier in development for the developers to create all of the different form fields that are going to populate with your content. So rather than having this all in one box, my menu items, which is what I'm going to call them instead, I have them each as their own individual item. Okay, great. So now I can group these together. I can see here when I have them all selected that they're not perfectly evenly spaced. So I'll click my tidy up button. And now I can see that there are exactly 27 pixels between each item. I'm just going to round that down to an even number, like 26, just for the sake of my brain. And now I can group these together and call this menu. But I want to add my little button to my menu too. So let's click and drag with my rectangle tool, which is hotkey R, to make a button. Looks like this button is about 110 pixels long and maybe 36 pixels tall. Let's go with 38. And then I can just take some type that I've already used, since it's about the size it needs to be. Copy and paste that. And then I can say button input for whatever my button is. And then Figma's really great. If I just click and drag this text over my rectangle, it's going to give me some smart guides that help me snap it exactly into place. So now that I've got my button made, I'm going to select the rectangle itself and the text and group that together and name this my button. It's about where I want it to be, but this is part of my menu too. So I'm just going to click and drag this into my menu section in my layer panel. So now this entire block is grouped. Okay, so the last thing that I want to do is create one of these product cards that has these different textures on them. So same as I've done before, I'm just going to really roughly block in all of this content. So I'm going to use my rectangle tool to just create the area that I want for my content. And like I've been doing, just adjust this to fit my grid that I've created. And rounding off my pixel dimensions, just so that they're nice and clean, rounded to the nearest 10. So I'm going to lower the opacity on this just so I can see through it a little bit as I start to then add my type on top of it. So I'm going to call, rather than type in this specific information, I'm just going to call this product name and increase the size of that a bit for the sake of our type hierarchy. Let's bring this up to 24. And now I can use my alignment tools just to make sure that my product name is totally centered in this rectangle I've created. And then I'll duplicate this and I'll put in, here is the product description. And similarly, just gonna bring the size of this down to match what I've got going on down here in my little subtitle. Let's make sure these are aligned and centered, again, using my align tools in my product or in my properties panel over here. I've got an image in here. Technically, this whole thing is an image with type on top, but for the sake of this prototype, I'm going to grab my image placeholder. I can press Alt, click and drag to duplicate it. And then I can resize it to be the size of this image that's going to go in this box. Let's just say it's roughly that size. And again, center it in the little box that we've made for this. So then we have a button down here. And rather than make a new button style, I'm just going to use this same basic button that I've already created. So if I select this, I can copy it and paste it, bring it on over here. And then from here, I can open up my group, take my rectangle that I've created to build my button and just expand that out a little bit to better match. I'll match it to the width of my image just for consistency's sake. And there we go. And now I've got my additional button. Perfect. Okay, so now that we have all of our basic elements in here, I can select my frame that I've made. I'm going to call this the shop section of the website in my layer panel. And I can add a fill here. So I'm just going to click plus. And you can see it's automatically added a white fill. If I turn that off, I can see my image that's hiding back here again. I didn't delete it. I just put a fill in this frame and it's on top of my image layer. So now I can't see that anymore. Okay, but I do still want to see it for a second. So let me just turn down the transparency on the fill of my frame. So I have two other cards here, and the same way I just duplicated the button from my menu, this is the same basic UI pattern on both of these. So I can double click on this product card that I made, and let's get everything grouped together, nice and organized, so that it's all together, it's all selected. I can group this and call this product card. And now I don't need to recreate that all again. I can just press Alt and Shift and drag it to duplicate it and build out the wireframe for the rest of this section. So there you have it. There is the basics of wireframing. I'll give this section a colored fill just so I can see it a little easier, maybe a light gray. Now I can turn off my guides by pressing Shift G. And now I can see I've made a wireframe version of this section of the website. You would take this same basic process for each section of your website until you've reversed wireframed the whole thing. So you can see here what the finished wireframe might look like. You really are simplifying the design as much as possible in order to create like a really bare bones guide for what the design of the website will eventually be. So you can see here I've simplified some of the copy. I've created really simple buttons and really taken the design out of the website, or rather the aesthetic design of the website, and just left the user interface and experience design in its place, just the shell, or it's sort of like the skeleton of the website. So that is your basic intro to wireframing. I hope that you learned some basics from this tutorial and are able to carry them into your journey with web design.